Welcome to part 10 of my guide to video game history. For this episode I wanted to rewind back to 1985 and go through the quality arcade games being released until 1988. We really need to do a dedicated episode for this because this was the golden age of arcade games, where games were at the forefront of gaming, pioneering the way for home machines to follow. So without further ado, let's go straight into it. The year is 1985 and Capcom releases Commando, which is the first vertical run and gun game to gain a huge popularity. The game had you play one soldier against an entire army where you must rescue hostages. It was written by Toku Fujiwara, a Capcom master who would go on to bring the world Mega Man and our next game. That game was Ghosts and Goblins, also released this year, and it was a titanium hard platform game where you played Arthur the Knight who must rescue his loved one, Princess Prin Prin. Atari this year released a brilliant vertical fantasy shooter called Gauntlet, which allowed up to 4 players to play at the same time. The characters you could play was Thor the Warrior, Questa the Elf, Merlin the Wizard, and Thydra the Valkyrie. The game was written by Ed Logg, he of Asteroids and Centipede fame, but it was inspired by the Atari 8-bit game called Dandy. Ed built the game with cooperative gameplay in mind, though in my mind the game was more about arguments and rivalry, as there would always be one player who would run around snaffling up all the food and goodies. You know who you are. Konami this year released Gradius, known as Nemesis in the West. It was a frantic horizontal shooter that would really be the inspiration for most horizontal blasters to follow. Yu Suzuki, who previously had some success with Champion Boxing and Champion Wrestling, in 1985 he would catapult himself and Sega into the apex of game designers. He did this with 2 games released this year. The first was Hang On. This allowed the player to control a motorbike around different courses, passing all the checkpoints before the time ran out. It had great handling and absolutely stunning 3D looking graphics, aided by the powerful Sega hardware. Also, on the deluxe cabinet, it allowed you to actually sit on the bike and tilt the bike in the direction, really adding to the fun. His second game was even more astounding. It was called Space Harrier, and it had you controlling a jetpack-wearing, muscle-bound hero armed with a laser gun. You had to fly around the brightly coloured, surreal world called Fantasy Zone, blasting everything in your path. The game is a real adrenaline rush, especially if you were lucky enough to play the deluxe sit-down cabinet, where the cabinet would actually move with the game, totally immersing you in the action. This kind of deluxe cabinet was also a first for any arcade game. Konami released the Versus beat-em-up IR Kung Fu this year, where you had to fight through a multitude of different enemies, each with their own skill and weaponry. The following year, in 1986, would also be a great year for arcade goers. Taito came out with the update to Atari's game Breakout. It was called Arkanoid, and it was essentially the same game with better graphics, different block layouts, and power-ups. Also, in 1986, Taito released a classic platformer called Bubble Bobble, where you had 2 chaps called Bub and Bob, who not only had their girlfriends kidnapped by a psychotic evil wizard, but they also were turned into bubble-blowing dragons. Bit of a strange choice for the psychotic evil wizard. One would have thought a slug would have been more suitable, but there you go. Bub and Bob decide to go on a massive quest, taking on all the evil cute minions to rescue their beloved one. Technos this year released a scrolling beat-em-up that would define the genre. It was called Renegade, and it had 1 or 2 players who must beat up a gang of punks. In Japan it was called Neketsu Koha Kunyo-kun, which means roughly fiery tough guy called Kunyo. Don't you love those catchy Japanese titles? Also this year, Tradewest and SNK in Japan would design and release Ikari Warriors. This was another vertical run and gun game like Commando that allowed you to have a fellow gamer join in with the action. The word Ikari means angry, and there was a nod to the second Rambo film, which in Japan was called Ikari no Dasutsu. or roughly The Furious Escape. Midway this year released the Monster Smasher classic called Rampage. This allowed you to play up to 3 players, and you could take on one of those monsters to smash, destroy and munch your way through the city. You could choose between George, the King Kong-like gorilla, Lizzie, the Godzilla-like lizard, or Ralph, who was a giant werewolf. The game was great fun and packed full of humour and destructibility. Also in 1986, Yu Suzuki came back with another absolute hit for Sega. It was called Outrun. It was a superb game with great handling and a joy to both your eyes and ears as you race through the exotic locales across Europe, choosing your path to one of 5 endings. The following year, in 1987, Yu Suzuki did it again, this time with Afterburner, which was a game that capitalised on the Top Gun film craze around this time. It had you fly an American F-14 Tomcat across different terrains, taking out wave after wave of enemy jet fighters. The game would quickly have a sequel a few months later called Afterburner 2, which was basically identical to the first but added more levels. It was a sequel that most people will have played, and you'll be able to tell this by looking at the title screen, where on one of the screens it shows the letter 2. Konami this year released Contra, or Greiser as we knew it in Europe. This had you take control of 2 commandos on a rock-hard mission to seemingly shoot everything in sight, and it was one of the first run-and-gun horizontal shooters that defined this genre. Also this year, Technos took what they learned from the game Renegade and released a spiritual sequel with a massively popular game called Double Dragon. This time you took the roles of one of 2 brothers. There was Billy and Jimmy Lee, who must fight through an evil gang called the Black Warriors to save their loved one. The game was massive in the arcades, and it really kick-started the popularity of the scrolling beat-em-up genre. Another classic released in 1987 was Operation Wolf by Taito. This was a great on-rails first-person shooter, which had you as a lone soldier sent to rescue hostages out in the jungle and shoot cats. The best thing about the game was the Uzi-looking gun that you would use. That, when you shot things, would vibrate as you blasted everything in sight. Namco this year also came out with another Pac-Man sequel, this time taking the isometric viewpoint and much larger maps, offering the player 4 different worlds for you to explore. IREM this year released a fantastic horizontal shooter called R-Type. This set you in a futuristic world, biomechanical alien horrors, only known as the Baido Empire. The game was great, with loads of great power-ups and innovative gun charge system, and it is a game that has been much copied since. 1987 also saw the release of a sequel, Bubble Bobble by Taito, this time calling it Rainbow Islands. In the game, Bub and Bob have become human again, and they're now on a quest to save Rainbow Islands as they're being sunk into the sea. Now, Bub and Bob can make rainbow bridges, and they must make their way to the top and collect the magic star before the island is lost forever. Sega released this year the brilliant ninja game called Shinobi, which means clanless warrior. In the game you play a ninja called Joe Masashi, who must rescue kids taken hostage by the criminal clan called the Zed. The game was great, allowing you to throw shurikens and kick your way through the enemies and defeat the clan bosses. Capcom this year in 1987 released Street Fighter. Written by Takashi Nishiyama, it had many innovative features, so having special attack moves in the game. The game wouldn't have the same astronomical popularity of its sequel, which was designed by Yoshiki Okamoto, but interestingly, Takashi, who wrote this game, would go on to SNK and would be the man behind the awesome King of Fighter games. Finally, Yu Suzuki at Sega was back again in 1987 with a sequel to Hang-On called Super Hang-On. This was more of the same, but with better graphics and the ability to use a turbo for extra speed. Well, that's some of the great arcade releases from 1985 to 1987. Of course, there were tons more, and there was many games I wanted to include, include. So I've decided to do another video that will have a medley of all the games that I wasn't able to include within this video. Well, in the next episode we're going to look back at the 8-bit home computer over this era of 1985 to 1987. So until next time, see you later.